Fuel for the Aztec and European war machines, a catalyst for massive industrial innovation, and a tasty treat adored by chocoholics across the globe. It was enjoyed by powerful emperors on both sides of the Atlantic and filled the pockets of enterprising missionaries. With its roots as a spicy and fatty drink in ancient Mesoamerica, how did chocolate eventually become the guilty pleasure of billions? Let's find out. Spread across the jungles of the Gulf Coast of Mexico are enormous carved stone heads. These slightly chubbier versions of the Moi belong to the Olmecs and are nearly 3,000 years old. The Olmecs are our original chocolatiers, and we have a linguistic and archaeological evidence linking them to cacao cultivation at least as far back as 1000 BC. They drank it as a bitter beverage rather than the solid sweet that we know today. How did these ancient people turn this into their favourite chocolatey beverage? Well, first they would ferment and then sun dry and then roast and deshell the cacao beans, leaving them with something called a nib, and that was ground and melted into something that we know as chocolate liqueur, which would have tasted a little bit like extremely bitter dark chocolate. Mix that up with some honey, vanilla, or even some chilies and you've got yourself a traditional Mesoamerican cacao drink. They especially loved the froth that would kind of develop on top of this drink and would even pour it from one cup into another from a standing height to try and develop as much froth as possible on top. Soon enough, long distance trade routes sprang up across the region, connecting cacao growers with cacao consumers. Cacao soon found itself a central part in Mesoamerican ceremonies, especially weddings, kind of filling the role that fancy French champagne does in our society. It was so highly valued that it was used as currency throughout the region, which eventually even inspired counterfeiters that moulded fake beans out of clay or even carved avocado seeds. And to kind of give you an idea of how much these beans were worth, you could buy an avocado for 1 bean, a sleigh for 100 beans, and a sweet jet ski with sick flames on the side for 7,000 beans. So every time an Olmec, Mayan or Aztec drank a cup of chocolate, they were essentially drinking money, like lighting a cigar on fire with a €100 note. After their rise to power in the 15th century, the Aztecs fell in love with drinking chocolate, but it wouldn't grow in their highland climate. So what's a 15th century chocoholic warlord to do? Invade and conquer cacao growing regions and demand tribute, obviously. Once secured, chocolate became a drink reserved for the top echelons of Aztec society, but the military were some of the few commoners that were allowed to drink it. It was issued to them in wafer form so they could easily mix it with water or maize gruel for an instant nutrition boost. When the Spanish arrived in the Americas, they quickly invaded the Mayan Yucatan in 1517 and Aztec Mexico in 1519, and with the help of hundreds of thousands of native allies and old world diseases, they conquered them and set up New Spain in their now shattered realm. The Mayans had introduced the Spanish to using cacao beans as currency, which they quickly accepted, but getting them to drink it, however, was a bit of a challenge. Europeans' initial reactions to chocolate was one of complete and utter disgust. My favourite example is that of Girolamo Benzoni, who when he was travelling in Central America was repeatedly offered the drink by the natives, and every single time he would vehemently reject it, calling it a drink fit for pigs, and was completely perplexed at why the natives would walk away from him laughing every single time he did so. This wasn't until he ran out of wine and was essentially forced to drink it and discovered that he actually loved it. And much like Benzoni, the Spanish conquistadors turned colonists also had to grow to like chocolate. At this point, it's important to note that nearly all the Spanish in New Spain were men, so they had to marry and rely on native women that would have cooked for them and their new children traditional Aztec and Mayan foods. This mixing would create a brand new mestizo culture, one that drank chocolate. While this society was emergent, another group of influential soon-to-be chocolate drinkers arrived on the scene: Christian missionaries, and most importantly, the Jesuits. In their work trying to convert the natives, these missionaries were plied full of chocolate and soon realised how lucrative it might be if they traded it. Once the New Worlders and missionaries and merchants started crisscrossing the Atlantic with their new chocolate habits and gifting chocolate to their princes and popes, the European Spanish eventually shed their apprehension and tried the beverage. Until the 1590s, chocolate rarely crossed the Atlantic, but by the 1620s, millions of pounds of it were being imported into Spain. And so chocolate spread upwards, from pagan to missionary, from coerced wives to conquistador husbands, all the way until it reached the lips of kings and queens. And so while this beverage was crossing cultural barriers, the word chocolate itself was crossing linguistic ones. Most early Spanish sources call chocolate cacahuat, an Aztec word for cacao water. The Spanish eventually combined the Mayan word for hot, which is chocol, and the Aztec word for water, which is at, together to form chocolate, which would eventually become chocolate. Why exactly would the Spanish do this? Well, let's just imagine why a Romance language speaker might be a little bit uncomfortable calling his new favourite thick brown and frothy beverage cacahuat. In the 18th century, we see chocolate spreading out of Spain, first to Italy, where it was drank by the likes of Grand Duke Cosimo III de' Medici, and here it's mixed with jasmine sugar and ambergris, which is the intestinal secretions of a sperm whale. The Italians proved slightly more creative in their chocolate recipes than the Spanish, who mostly drank it the same way the Mesoamericans did. We start seeing some pastas with chocolate and even a lasagna with chocolate and anchovy sauce. Yum. Back in the New World, the Jesuits were making insane amounts of money from their cacao plantations. In 1701, a shipment arrived in Cadiz. 8 huge crates marked chocolate for the revered Father General of the Company of Jesus. Dock workers found it near impossible to lift these crates due to their weight, and when inspectors found chocolate bars inside, they were incredibly heavy, and only after running their fingers along them did they notice that they were in fact solid gold bars coated in chocolate. And while the Jesuits were making money hand over fist and the likes of Cosimo de' Medici were enjoying their morning chocolate, the Native American populations were plummeting. Less than 10% were left. And in order to maintain manpower, slaves had to be imported from West Africa to cacao plantations in Brazil, Ecuador and Venezuela. The roles of the Mesoamericans in the history of their own beverage was essentially at an end. By the beginning of the 19th century, chocolate was an aristocratic drink that conjured up images of Catholic clergy and nobility, but it arrived in the 20th century as something available to most. How? Enter Napoleon. No, the other Napoleon. Yeah. The Napoleonic Wars and all the blockades and destabilization that came along with them contributed to the independence revolutions that swept Latin America and cut Europe off from its cheap chocolate supply. Coffee and tea, however, could still be brought in through Asia, and so chocolate paved the way for them to overtake it as Europe's bitter caffeinated beverages of choice. The consumption and production of chocolate declined for essentially the only time in its history, but it's during this decline that innovators began to tinker with chocolate in order to make it faster to produce and more appealing to all. A Dutchman by the name of Van Houten, who unfortunately is not an owl, invented a press that removed most of the fat from cacao. Removing this fat, or cacao butter, made the drink easier to mix with water. Soon, the British company J.S. Fry & Sons discovered that adding cacao butter back into the mix at a later stage made chocolate that was solid, mouldable and less dry. This first real chocolate bar wouldn't really be palatable to us. We'll need the Swiss to perfect this new recipe. The likes of François-Louis Callier and Philippe Sucard were devising better ways of processing chocolate, and a guy named Daniel Peter was trying to combine both milk and chocolate together. He was having trouble separating the water from the milk, which was necessary in order to avoid mildew. That was until he joined forces with his neighbour Henry Nestle, who had just made a small fortune selling powdered milk. Thus, milk chocolate was born. And then, after Rudolf Lindt invented conching, a process that made chocolate much smoother, re-arrived at the modern chocolate bar. Smooth, milky, and filled to the brim with sugar. This new industrialized form of chocolate quickly dethroned the fatty beverage that once refreshed emperors and popes. Marketing soon entered the fray to open up the product to even more people. In 1861, Richard Cadbury introduced the world to the first chocolate box, and right after, he started selling heart-shaped boxes for Valentine's Day, beginning the now inseparable relationship of Valentine's, love, and chocolate. Richard Cadbury was a marketing genius. He knew he needed to sell the emotions and ideals of chocolate rather than just chocolate itself. And if chocolate isn't associated with the emotions and ideals you want to sell, that's fine. Just make some up and market the crap out of it. Cover your chocolate boxes with pictures of girls holding kittens. Plaster ads across the country with frolicking cherub-faced children eating your chocolate. Really focus on selling the milk part of your milk chocolate, because chocolate is no longer an indulgence for the rich, it's actually a healthy treat for all the family. Soon enough, this kind of branding was used by most chocolate companies. Chocolate started being pictured alongside alpine meadows and caring nurses or milkmaids that promised the consumer that this product is both pure and nurturing. These images are quite ironic when you consider the rampant adulterations carried out by food companies in the 19th century. A medical journal from that era tested food products sold to the public and discovered that over half of chocolates on sale contained ground bricks, and some even had lead in there. And while I thoroughly enjoy consuming lead, people back then were quite outraged. Even Cadbury itself was touched by the scandal, as they were caught bulking up their chocolate with cheap stuff like potato starch. Ingeniously, they used this to their advantage though, and started claiming that their chocolate was now the purest on the market. Their slogan even changed to "Absolutely pure, therefore best." Chocolate was now thoroughly modern, in its final smooth, sugary and delicious form. However, it relied on an 18th century style supply chain, and still does today. You see, when chocolate production declined in Latin America and all that handy free labour just dried up when countries started banning slavery, the chocolate industry had to secure a cheap supply of cacao for itself. So, what do you do if you can't transport slaves from West Africa to your plantations? Easy. You transport your plantations to West Africa. The Portuguese brought cacao trees to their colony in Sao Tome, and it soon found itself the world's largest exporter of cacao. The British colony in modern-day Ghana soon followed suit and was quickly joined by the Ivory Coast. Thus, our modern cacao supply chain was born. Today, the Ivory Coast and Ghana supply around 70% of the world's cacao. And while slavery was abolished in the Americas by 1875, it's still present in cacao production in West Africa. Journalistic efforts in recent years have done an excellent job shedding some light on this issue, and especially on the issue of child slavery. This heinous enterprise can hardly be overstated, especially with the likes of Nestle failing to meet the standards set on them to eliminate child slavery from their supply chain. And it is truly an enormous stain on the reputation of the chocolate industry. There will be further information on this subject in the description. However, in recent years, the Fair Trade certification has gained popularity and promises humane labour practices and fair prices for farmers. And while Fair Trade is far from perfect, it is providing a possibly less dark future for chocolate and those that grow cacao. It has even helped native Mayans once again grow and manufacture their own chocolate, so that they can once again take part in the story of the traditional beverage. So that's the bittersweet history of chocolate. It had been an elite drink among the rainbow-feathered Mesoamericans and remained that for the perfumed and overdressed nobility of Europe. Spread by filthy rich missionaries and brought to the masses by ingenious inventors, a crop that has a dark history of slavery, but now has a possible new future with fair trade that could potentially improve the lives of farmers and communities in undeveloped regions. All from a skinny little tree called Theobroma cacao, literally food of the gods. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please leave your feedback in the comments down below. Don't forget to check out my sources in the description because unfortunately I can't put all the information in the video. If you'd like to support the show, there are links to my t-shirt store below too. Thanks for watching.